Okay, we're running a little late, but with the hour 5 past 5, I'd like to open the meeting. Just get the easy stuff out of the way first. Did everybody have a chance to look at the minutes for December 20th? And I'll entertain a vote to,
I'll make a motion to
Make a
accept the
motion.
minutes of December 20th.
I second.
you weren't there?
He wasn't there, so there's three of us. I don't know.
All
if
right,
that's
so we
a
have no
quorum.
quorum, we have to push that off.
Okay.
Do you want to take notes?
Well,
Oh, you're taking notes, okay. Sorry.
Do we have Danell on or no?
Danell's not on, no.
All right, because we would have had a, wait a minute, can he vote from a Zoom or no?
He can, but he's not on.
But he's not on, so it's moot. But if he does come on and we have a vote,
Go
we
back to
can
it.
go back to a quorum on that one.
Minutes, yeah.
For the minutes, okay. All right, so we'll move past that. Starting with the first order of business, we've been trying to get this group in for a couple of months now, I think, and we've had some just scheduling problems, but I'm glad they're here today. Presentation from the Peregrine, is that how you pronounce it, Peregrine Group?
Correct, yeah.
And about what the potential of the reuse of the former town hall, old town hall, at 980 Main Street. So I'll turn it over to you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
So, Mr. Chair, I didn't know if we formally introduced, so this is Eric Bush. Eric Bush is the consultant for the Peregrine Group.
Great. Nice to see you, Eric.
Welcome, Eric.
Welcome.
Great to meet you all, and thanks for having me in. Sorry about if, I know some of the scheduling issues are on my side, so apologies for the
No worries.
delay. But glad, thank you for the opportunity to come and kind of present a bit of a work in progress as we've been working with some folks in the room in looking at the building. So in way of introduction and a little bit of context, so as Patrick said, Eric Bush, I'm the managing partner of a group called the Peregrine Group. We're a real estate advisory firm located in Rumford, Rhode Island. Do a lot of development advisory work for different projects, a ton of historic rehab from a financing, project management perspective. And been in business for about 20 years. We've got a staff of about 15 professionals that range from architect to finance folks in office. So what we've been doing and what we've been up to, and I thought it was important to kind of revisit some of the context here, is for quite a few months now, but at kind of a walking, a jogging pace, not a sprint. We've been coming up to speed and having a lot of kind of interactive discussions with folks in town. And just looking back, and I know for many in the room, this is, you know better than I, all of the work and great work that's been done over the course of time and looking at this building and some of the studies that have been done. Kind of focusing here on the slide of some of the more recent, and I won't take the time to kind of read off the slide here. But for what it's worth, from my perspective and looking, dozens and dozens of projects and looking on behalf of a town or city in town, looking at historic buildings or properties that they have and ways to move forward with those. Really impressed, really high-quality, thoughtful reports. And again, for what it's worth, I know, I don't sit here with the authority to say that work is good or bad, but really thoughtful, really high quality. You can tell there's been a lot of love, care, thought into reusing the building, doing the studies, and there are quite a few of them. I want to point out, that a couple of the RFPs that went out in 2019 and 2020, one based after the feasibility study that was really in depth in 2019. And then most recently, and what really kind of brought us to the table, was a study that Compass did earlier this year, I believe it was, or earlier in 22. That really looked at costs and looked at some of the physical attributes of the building, and I think that led to, from our understanding, a discussion about, well, there's things that could be done in the building, but do we go that far and start to spend resources, spend dollars, if we don't know what the end goal is? And that's what led to the discussion to bring us on board and start to look at, from a different perspective that I'll get into in a minute. Also want to point out some grant applications from the town in 21. There was a one-stop application for underutilized properties, which is a program we've used in a couple of other municipalities around the state. It wasn't successful. And then as we talk to folks in town, as we talk to some potential users, there's been a lot of folks that we reached out to was saying, what are your thoughts on the opportunity here? and we often were met with the response, oh, I've been through the building, we've got some sketched up plans, I've done some budgeting, I've looked at it. So it's clearly been looked at for a long time and in many thoughtful ways. So further context here, the key question that we were brought in to help try and answer, and really want to point out on the bottom here that the question for us coming in was not to create some sort of report. And I want to mention that, I'm jumping ahead on my slide a little bit, but understanding that there's been a lot of reports, I think the last thing that people want to spend resources on was, let's get another opinion on, good work that's been done in the past. This was really about why haven't we been successful with these RFPs? And I think there's lots of reasons, the different forces and factors, that timeline introduces COVID, different market cycles, all sorts of things. But the key questions here, we've had a lot of people look at it with past RFPs, with what is a great location right in the middle of a lot of other activity, which is a really outstanding building, both aesthetically, historically. It's just a rich part of the fabric of downtown. Why isn't this happening? And I think the conclusion that we heard again and again was, well, if it was easy to do, it would have been done already, because there's been so much effort. And so as we were in these discussions, it was really about, okay, can we put on the hat of that prospective developer, prospective operator that might be responding to an RFP either in the past or, if you decide to go out with an RFP in the months to come. Can you take that lens and kind of look at it? And that's where we come in, because we do this kind of development, both for our own portfolio and mostly for others. But that market perspective, that development perspective can be, a little bit harsh, because it's looking at, if I own this, how would I go and finance it? And that's kind of the approach that we came, and the intent was to help and kind of shape and lead to discussions like this, where maybe there's a different perspective or a new perspective or refreshing a perspective to help guide what happens next. And I know I'm overdoing context here, but I think it's important. So one of the things we've heard over and over again, and we try to be very thoughtful up front and say, what are the goals here? What are the goals? Because in some of the areas we've come in as an advisor, it might be, we need to maximize the value of this building and get the highest dollar. Or that doesn't matter, we just want to preserve. And what we heard were, and I'm sure people have different weights to these, but what we heard were these common, and they're not in any particular order, but the preservation and protection of that building was paramount. We heard about the fact that buildings like this that are kind of carried on the city's roles from a budgetary perspective, for some, is a number one issue, where you see that you're spending $25,000, $30,000 a year to keep it kind of occupied, not occupied, but warm, heated, and keeping things intact. And then, of course, there's some capital expenses that start to accrue after there's some deferred maintenance and such buildings. And then, of course, building upon the activity, that catalytic component that this could bring. And then also a common theme was just, and I think it comes through in a lot of those earlier reports, such rich history, such a big part of the town. How do you somehow preserve the ability for folks to be able to come in and not just put up walls and create a private development, but how can that kind of integrate into the community? So those were the goals that we heard. And so translating that into kind of procedure and process in looking at this, again, as part of a process, not as a report, was to really first and foremost, instead of jumping in and trying to figure everything out, really sit down, and this was, because we've had a run in trying to set this meeting, this was actually probably the summer, early to mid-summer, started to look at all those past reports. Our team came up to speed, myself and a couple colleagues in my office. We met with the team on site, we walked the neighborhood, we walked the building, we kind of dug around after reading those reports so we could get a good handle on work that's been done, thought that's been given, and the physical state. And then as part of that, in those ongoing discussions, our next step was really to start to get some feedback from the community, folks that had looked at it before, or potential users, operators who, as we looked at it, were some of those things that we heard, there's been an interest in, co-working office space. There's an interest in retail. There's an interest in event space that was really well detailed in the 2019 report. So taking that knowledge, taking what we were sort of gathering, and then being able to have fresh conversations with folks and saying, why didn't you respond to that RFP? Are you still interested? What's that level of interest? what's stopping you from responding to previous RFPs or really trying to, after your walkthroughs, after your plans were done, what was that impediment that you saw? So we were informed by others' experience. And then we started to see things kind of boil down into categories, this, high demand and I think a lot of activity and energy around arts and culture, kind of a shared office model because there's some successful, in the kind of sub-market, there's some successful operators that are overflowing and see this as a great potential addition. So I think the demand is strong, and I think you all know that. And of course, residential, I know it hasn't always been top of line for everyone in the past, but we thought from a feasibility perspective, from a development perspective, that we should probably take a look at that, very high level, but feasibility-wise, does it make any sense to start to talk about apartments on upper floors, maintaining access in the lower floors, even though it might not be the perfect solution, getting a sense of how feasible is that? And these key factors, and I'm going back in time, and I know there's probably folks in the room that were very involved in these reports in past work. Pulling from the Compass report, and did have conversations with some of the folks that authored that report to make sure we were understanding it correctly. But the basic, again, I won't read from it, but the basic gist of it is there's an opportunity to kind of use as is with some light touches, light improvements. But in general terms, and happy to dive into it, but in general terms, once you start to really change the use, you get into exceeding 50% of it, you really tip into a scenario where the building really has to be looked at from modern codes, modern accessibility standards. What I'm talking about is not black and white. This is shades of gray here along the line. But essentially, if we boil it down, you could use the building as is, business activity with light touches, but once you start getting into really making changes, active uses, a previous study had kind of an assembly use, you start to tip into these needs to really address the building, bring it up to modern codes, which is really kind of the crux of the problem that we heard from folks and that we've heard from folks repeatedly and repeatedly is we'd love to do it. If we needed to go in there and make renovations, we would sort of tip into suddenly addressing accessibility needs, modern code needs, fire safety needs for the entirety of the building, and the costs just start to get a little bit away from feasibility model. But a key factor too I want to point out is in the 2019 study, the sort of basic renovation costs here were about $5.5 million as they were listed. Given even those couple years, unfortunately, we've seen costs really rise. We've seen codes evolve a little bit here and there. In the Compass study, they actually thought that equivalent work was approaching now $7 million just because of the nature of the market. And we know these things, do go up and down. They tend to go up and stick a little bit more than they come back down. But we really used this Compass update to the 2019 data as our baseline for costs. And what we did with that is we put together some financial models. Again, with the contextual piece of bringing this perspective of a potential developer, operator coming in and assuming this building, whether it be lease, acquisition, whatever it may be. If we put that hat on and said we're going to be that party that comes in, we wanted to sort of create a model, a simple financial model, real estate model that said, okay, here's our cost basis, here's what we'd have to do to it. What does that mean from a feasibility perspective? I want to point out a couple key assumptions, and then we'll actually go into the model, and I'll try to stay out of the weeds. But budget assumptions are really culled from past models. We did not do an advanced design study, go out and cost it, anything like that. We really tried to just take what was previously done and adjust a little bit, not much. We assumed, for the sake of simplicity here, that there was no land or acquisition cost. So no lease payments, no acquisition of the building, but just, if someone were to pick it up for $1, for something nominal. From a rent perspective, whether it be for somebody who would come in and be part of an office environment, somebody in an apartment, we did a survey, quite a bit of sort of comparables from a rent perspective around the market and the sub-market. We pulled from was CoStar, which is a subscription service that lets you pull data, kind of like an MLS type system. pulled lots of data and information from other buildings in the area, things that would be kind of competitors, just to get an order of magnitude, what would these rents potentially look like in this location? Operating expenses, based on, experience, based on appraisals, based on, very conceptual level, but plugging something in, we know we have certain costs that would be, part of the equation of how to make the building work. And then what we did is we really started to apply, if we had these rents coming in, we had these costs to develop this building, we had these operating expenses, we'd have some sort of income, just like any, development project. What could we go out and borrow on the debt market? What could we go and raise from an equity perspective, from an investment perspective? And does that really, do those points meet? Does the cost and the value and the ability to finance this start to meet? And we knew, going in, that they probably wouldn't, but we wanted to understand how different those points are. And what we did is try and solve for this funding gap. If we had some source of funds, we could plug in to the sources of funding to do a project here in a redevelopment. Are we talking 80% or 20%? And I think it's a different approach depending on that. And we knew some of those sources that we could assume, so we went ahead and calculated that. So, I'm doing a long prep to get into the models here. We've got all different scenarios. They're all very kind of trend towards the same line. This here is a mixed use, so assuming apartments over some sort of retail or commercial use on the first floor. And if I can walk through this at a high level, and I know the last thing people want to do in the evening is have somebody walk through a spreadsheet with them, but what we did is basically say by floor, every one of these assumptions could be challenged, could be changed, could be refined. We've run it lots of different ways. We're at a very order of magnitude conceptual level. I want to keep saying that. But we looked at it and said, okay, if you've got square footage, you've got a number of apartments here, we start to apply a rent number. So in this case, we say that there are apartments on basically through the building, except for the lower level. We assume rents at kind of market-ish, which is $1,950 per month per unit from the first floor, just over $2,000 above. What does that start to look like from a revenue-generating opportunity here? And then we take that number and we apply, like I said, operating expenses and all sorts of things to it. I'm not sure if I just skipped this. No, okay. And we start to use those for those who are in real estate, kind of an income approach to value. You say this building will produce X dollars in annual revenue. What would it be worth to the market? What's the value of that building after it's developed? And that comes through in what you could go borrow. If you're borrowing from a bank to do a construction loan, they want to know that collateral value is there, and it helps them. That's how they gauge what they can lend against it. The same with an equity investor. If you had a commercial market sort of equity investor, they'd want some level of return to match the risk here. What would they be willing to put in? So it's really all based on that cash flow, that income approach to valuation. I'm happy to answer any questions on that. But we applied that, and it's kind of in the bottom box here. While up top, we really use this budget, and again, every one of these assumptions should be challenged, could be challenged, needs to be refined, but we used old reports, the Compass numbers to plug in here and there. We made some contingency adjustments. We didn't go overboard, I don't believe, in adding kind of additional fit-out costs, but I do believe apartments would be probably a pretty expensive endeavor by the time you put in all the plumbing for kitchens and bathrooms, et cetera. But what we came up with in this order of magnitude conceptual level is it's probably about an $8 million plus dollar project to create this program. And again, we ran this model for different programs, and I'll mention that in a minute. But for this program of apartments above that lower level of commercial space, call it an $8 million project, which, given our assumptions, I don't think is too conservative. What would it be worth, and what could we borrow against it, et cetera? And our approximate market value there on the bottom, which is our income less our expenses, and then taking that income and applying a market rate to how you convert sort of income to value. Bottom line is we showed about an $8 million budget against about a $3.7 million value. So it would cost you $8 million to rehab this building, create this new thing. That thing would be worth about 3.7 million. So that gap, where we're talking from a funding perspective, is significant, is real. And I think this speaks to the past RFP process, responses consistent with folks that we've heard, whether it be looking at it for a brewery, a restaurant, event space. We heard the same thing of, we looked at it, we had a contractor look at it, they came back with a number, we looked at what we're paying, we'd have to pay in rent or pay, or get in rent to do it, and there's this disconnect of order of magnitude, a couple $1 million. And I think we sort of saw that. So on this page, some of the detail for those who are interested in it, what we assumed on interest rates, term, equity return, things like that. Happy again to talk through any of this, except that it all should be challenged and beat up, and we ran this model probably 25 times. At the end of the day, what we saw here is that this funding gap, in this case, was about 40%. And this is after assuming some state historic tax credits, which are not automatic. You have to compete, and you have to kind of get in the queue for them and hope for an award. The federal historic, with the right structuring, I think are much more predictable. But bringing those into it, we could see that you could probably get to around 25 to 30% of costs offset by those subsidies, but still remaining, you'd have this gap of 40-ish%. Not insurmountable, but our goal was to take this perspective and look at it, not to create a report. This is not intended to be a report that we're sort of stamping and submitting, because we'd probably do 20 of these scenarios and include them as case study. But I think indicative of feedback that we got, again, the disconnect between what it's going to take to really wholesale redevelop the building, change of use, all those triggers that get kicked off, versus what someone could go and have a value if they wanted to go finance it. So it speaks to the need for, for some assistance. And again, happy to dive into the weeds, but if we apply the same thinking for, we have some very successful multi-tenant office spaces in the area that are managed kind of hot desk or transient office, especially post-COVID. You see demand has been really strong in these. Two groups in particular that we spoke to, and I won't, trying to not name names because I don't want to say this person said and this person said, but we basically got, if that building, if we could do it for the right price, we'd do it in a heartbeat. We could fill it in a minute. There's so much demand. Why haven't you? Well, we looked at it. We could buy some other building and do it much easier. We could build a new building and do it much easier because of this cost burden that comes with this kind of enhanced use. And so if we plug in some assumptions there, and here, for what it's worth, we looked again at the market and did a survey. If we assume rents of $22 or so a foot, the lower level, which is a little bit less desirable, for 14 or so, and we could crank those up, crank those down. The bottom line doesn't change that dramatically, but we think still, you've got this gap of in the 40 to 50% range, even bringing in those historic tax credits at both the state and the federal level. And I want to take a step back and say, this is about a perspective of someone coming in, and hopefully, as someone who has financed a lot of these types of projects, it's bringing that perspective to it to help inform the next step, not standing here saying this is worthless. It's just trying to inform, maybe if there's another RFP, some user comes out of the woodwork and says, this is great, it's exactly what I want, we'll make it work. But I think there's a probability that others will come in, maybe do some due diligence, go through the same information we have, and sort of trend to that market answer, which says there's a pretty significant gap here to real whole-scale redevelopment. Just a couple other notes on the model, the quick abstracts there. We did run similar scenarios to the 2019 study for anybody that was involved with that, which was essentially restaurant use on the main floor, event space on the upper. We talked with multiple event operators and wedding operators about demand. There is demand. We heard consistently, You know, if it was half done or if it was done and we could come in and sort of fit it out, we'd love it. We'd sign tomorrow. What do we have to do? But they acknowledged it would be really impossible for us from a business, from an operating perspective, given those numbers, to just step in and make that work. And I think that kind of from a market perspective, again, with that perspective, if someone were to come in and say, I want to run my restaurant downstairs, use the bottom floor for a coffee shop and do an event space above, outstanding, that's great. That user would have to be able to absorb and pay a high rent, kind of above market, to afford, for that development to afford the improvements that need to happen, or, you know, bring in a whole bunch of different sources somehow to sort of fill the gap and make it marketable so that they could afford to make their improvements and operate in that space. I don't want to be repetitive, but general conclusions here, you know, big picture, as most people know, any significant change really starts to hit those triggers, and we start to really see this cost burden go up. If this building were 300,000 square feet, maybe it could absorb some of these costs because there'd just be that much more volume, you know, the density, the scale of it might make sense, but given the scale, you're kind of limited in being able to absorb some of those fixed costs that you'd have to incur. Unfortunately, costs have gone up. You know, we're seeing in the market costs sort of leveling a bit, but we don't see them, most professionals don't think they'll retreat, you know, to a pre-2019, 2018 level, unless there was some pretty dramatic economic issues. Interest rates have increased, that doesn't help. And so really what we're seeing is that to the marketplace, I think there needs to be this significant assistance to kind of make things viable. And I know I'm stating the obvious, I'm taking, you know, 20 minutes of your evening to state probably the most obvious thing that you all knew walking in. So the notion being that going out with another RFP may end up in the same place, may not, but there's a high likelihood of, given these numbers, that others will find the same conclusion.
Free cash.
Yeah.
So just to throw out, because I hate to sort of leave a problem out there without talking further, should I stop in it, ask questions, or keep going?
There you good,
Keep going?
good.
Just a couple other thoughts here, you know, typical ways to kind of reduce that funding gap that you see in other places, other cities and towns have taken. You know, if you break this down, there's kind of the most obvious, I think, typically is, well, reduce the cost burden. Let's take some dollars and let's start to rehab this building. Let's start to, you know, address some of this high fixed cost that they need, the building needs. And that works sometimes, you know, direct investment in improvements, whether it be from the public side or philanthropic side, you know, Friends of Old Town Hall. You know, people, and case study has done this and been able to sort of chip away at that burden and make it more feasible. Going out to market, but lining that up with other softer subsidies and sources that you can say, if someone were to come in with a good idea, prove that they have a track record, we'd be able to bring X resources to bear, you know, from the collective to help offset. I think offering a low or nominal acquisition or a lease payment is probably part of any equation, unfortunately. And then outside of just the pure sort of capital cost side, other tools that are used are, you know, looking at the revenue side, generating more revenue, helping somebody to generate more revenue, which may mean, in some cases, have certainly worked on projects with municipalities and states that have offered master leases, so they sort of take on some of that burden with an enhanced rent. You know, they pay a higher rent, whoever's using it pays a lower rent, and it allows people to go out, borrow more, you know, kind of fill in that gap and push the feasibility, offering various commitments on the guarantee side to help a private side really invest in it, or I think more typically on the operating expense side, you know, taking taxes, making them either through the TIF program, something like that, pushing those taxes down for a period of years that helps lower those operating expenses, helps increase the amount of dollars that they could put towards borrowing money, equity investment returns, et cetera. Offsetting some of the costs, you know, if the town continued to do maintenance and landscaping, snow plowing, whatever it may be. I know probably not making a lot of friends with some of these comments, but people do that. Shared infrastructure, I think parking-wise, I think that's already kind of baked in, given the location. On the financial side, if there's low-interest loans and things like that, that anything that can help to chip away at that cost burden, or that disconnect, I should say, between cost and value, these are some of the typical tools. And then I think, one of the things we've heard consistently is the potential to go right to an operator. If a developer was coming in, they would need an operator of some kind. If it wasn't residential mixed, apartments, they would need some form of operator. So it's almost like another layer. If you had the operator, you could put all this together and probably go out and have lots of people compete to do it. But finding that operator, someone who's bankable and would take the space and pay rent and all that is a key. And mercifully, that's the last of my slides. So happy to answer any questions or whatever I can do to help.
Anybody on EDC have any questions at all?
I'm good.
Just for clarification, and I think I know, but I want to just make sure, because I know there's a lot of people watching right now. So when you said that, you would talk to some of the people and the numbers that you came up with for, let's say, the first example that you gave was the mixed use with the residential above, and it would be somewhere in the 8+ million range to do the build out. And that's what, now, is that in addition to the 7 million to get the building up to where it needs to be as a baseline, or is that total?
That's the total. I do think it's probably a little bit higher than that, to be honest with you, but it's really building on that $7 million number from Compass, adding a little bit for the fact that you would have some additional costs and
Sure.
additional plumbing and things
Sure.
like that. But I do think it's a little bit light, but I'm sure we're all at this conceptual level, so the tendency is to be conservative by giving a higher number. So
Did the number that, and you touched on this, but having had a little bit of experience with doing renovations in old buildings and what kind of problems that can, the more you do, the more you uncover, and then you're in trouble sometimes with codes and whatnot. Is there any kind of a study that takes into consideration? Let me rephrase. I sat on that committee for a little while in 2019 on the reuse committee, and we were talking about doing a lot of things. And a lot of them were just completely almost gutting the building back to where it used to be, which it did not have a second and third floor. It was an open hall, if you will. And did your study or your running of the numbers take into consideration what it would be to bring that building up to modern day ADA, fire, every code for public use? Because we'd probably be uncovering everything in that building, in which case, at least in my experience, unless things have changed, once you open a wall or do something like that, now you have to bring it up to where it needs to be in today's world, with some exceptions, because some buildings just can't do it. But is that taken into that $7 million number?
It is generally. I mean, I think those reports are extremely thorough, and Compass's was as well, in looking at exactly those issues.
So the 7 is a worst-case scenario or an expected scenario that we could count on? Round numbers, not holding it.
I think so,
Okay.
yeah. Now, I think part of the challenge is we sit so far up on the conceptual side.
Sure.
Now, if you had a fixed program, you knew what it was going to be, the team, you'd have a team really design it, really get into it, really unpack it further, and there'd be potential to get relief on certain items. There would be, to your point, you'd find things, but you might get some relief on others.
Yeah.
I think you'd trend back to that number, given the information we have now, which
But
again, I
with
think
your
is very
experience,
thorough.
that's a pretty good number to start at, could go either direction.
I think so.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
But to be clear, to answer your original question, that 8 million plus number included the 7.
It's a total
Yeah,
number, so
it's
we're not talking 15, we're
No.
not talking 7 to get it at a baseline, and then another 8 on a build-out, we're talking, the 7's included in any number that you give in those examples.
That's right.
Okay. All right. I'd like to open it up to any questions for the public and people from other committees, if you have any. Yeah, go right ahead, Phil.
Should you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Philip Zakarowski, I'm on the planning board, precinct 7. And I just want to make a couple observations. First, thank you, and I want to thank also the other committees that have worked so hard on this, trying to allow us to preserve this building, which is so important to our history. But I just want to make a couple of observations. One is that when the original building was built, you know, the town fathers, and I don't really know the history, and others here may know more, but they apparently made that decision to invest in a really architecturally nice building, you know, not doing something that was just very minimalist. So they were making an investment in the future, giving us this building. So I think we need to look at that in the sense that we need to, I think the town's going to have to put some money up to make that comparable investment. Maybe this is the time to make that decision. And I would hope that if, you know, even though we have some maybe rental use, we also have some space that's public so that people can still go in it. I know other buildings, you know, somebody mentioned to me, they really wish they could go in the library and see what it looks like now. So, you know, obviously that's a private building now. And then the other point I wanted to make is that the cost to do any work right now, as we're talking about, is going up. But the sooner you do that work, the sooner you lock in that cost. So over time, if indeed we see inflation continuing and we are renting out part of it, then the income, you know, would also hopefully go up. But I just want to make a very strong recommendation. I just think the town needs to invest in it, and I think we need to make it a priority. It is such a, you know, a key building. It is Walpole, what we see a lot on pictures, and it is a very architecturally, very historic building that needs to be preserved. And I also think that there's opportunities maybe to use that space for art and things. I know, again, studies have looked at that. So it might be, you know, that's another opportunity to maybe add another service to the town. So thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Very well said.
So I guess, Eric, I have one question on, you know, obviously based on what Phil said, but you said on the additional assistance side, and maybe this is a little history, you know, what you've seen other people do. You know, obviously one would be the reduction in taxes, but is there an opportunity, in speaking to the town, of, you know, a joint investment with a developer? Is that something that occurs, or is that something very rare where a town would need to step in to be a joint investor in a property in order to keep the property viable?
It does happen. You know, I think that some of those tools, you know, like a lease of some sort, you know, if the town said, we'd really love that, a part of the building to be a showcase for art and be a service to the town. Again, if you're looking at, as a developer coming in and trying to figure out this puzzle, that's great. It doesn't help you be able to finance it. So can the town come up with a lease payment, X number of years at X amount, to lease that space and make it happen? Absolutely. Or, you know, any of those other things. Could they bring direct capital into it and say, well, we're going to invest in this. We're going to have, you know, a quasi-public or a nonprofit or something step in and do this portion of it. Absolutely. Those kind of partnerships work all the time.
I saw a hand in the audience. Yeah, come on up.
Lisa van der Linden, Finance Committee, thank you for being here. You did say there was some costs that the town pays now with utilities just to keep the building from tumbling over, something like $30,000 a year, I think you mentioned. Are there other costs that the town is paying now on an ongoing basis for that building?
I don't know the answer to that, truthfully.
I defer, from what I've seen,
Yeah, what does it cost us to just keep going the way we're going? What are we paying each year to do nothing?
I don't have that number.
Yeah.
And I'm actually,
I mean, there is the number that you
I
showed for
believe
the
it's the
utilities right
30K,
around
but I don't know.
30,000.
Yeah,
We can assume it's the 30K.
Sure. No, I would definitely echo what Phil said about acting now, because we are paying not just whatever those utilities are, but the cost of our failure to act on a beautiful building that is integral to our town. And if you're on Zoom, maybe you can't see this, but just sitting here in this room and noticing that the artwork on the walls is that building, the emblem of Walpole, and it's impossible to imagine it not existing or not being open to the people of Walpole.
Agreed. Sarah?
Okay. Sarah Katib, Destination Downtown. First, thank you. Just wondering if you can talk about, you had talked about the potential to do like historical tax credits or other avenues that the town can pursue. Can the town do that kind of without a developer, like, ready to go? Can they, get some of that funding now, or do we have to like do that together?
There are some sources, and some of them are called out in I think the 2019 report that very kind of breaks it down. But there are a number of sources, and we did kind of look around. I think that Mass Development One-Stop application.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it wasn't successful to
get
underutilized
it,
properties would be one.
Okay.
In terms of like the federal historic tax credits, the town directly wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of reasons.
The federal government wants to see that you have a project ready to go, basically.
You
Yeah.
have to be a taxable entity, you have
Yeah.
to
Okay.
need the tax credits.
Yeah.
And two, it's got to be a commercial use. It's tough to do if there's not a project that's creating revenue. It has a whole bunch of rules around it, and a taxable entity as part of that ownership tax. There's lots of structuring things you can do, but generally you need commercial income, commercial being apartments as well, or hotel, something that generates revenue, and is revenue producing, and then a taxable entity in the ownership stack.
Okay. So other than like the one-stop, are there things that you would recommend the town be pursuing to try to, do some of that maintenance costs, to do some of that upfront work?
There are some programs, I'm reticent to start listing them because I know the town has tried on a couple. But yeah, there are some sources. I don't think there's anything that's super easy and just sitting there on the shelf.
Yeah.
I do know on a number of those programs, and just from experience of working on it, on projects that have been able to successfully bring in mass development money or mass works money, I think that path to the bigger picture or leveraging other dollars becomes really important. And we hear it again and again from those agencies that are reviewing. We love this project, especially a MassWorks or something like that. We love this project because it's bringing X dollars from the private side. It's bringing federal dollars.
Yeah.
Once you start to bring in those other sources and leverage those dollars into a larger investment, I think it becomes a much more compelling conversation. But certainly, there are some sources that the town could go after now to try and stabilize or pick away at it.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sarah? I have a question for you, and just obviously not holding you to any numbers. I know we are in this process right now. This was an overview with experience brought in to tell us kind of where we stand and what the future could hold. So a question for you is, it could be, just to go back to what Phil said, and to expound on that just a little bit. Phil, you're exactly right. I believe this building is a public trust for this town. I believe that building, well, first of all, I don't think it's going anywhere. Did that get on the historic register?
Yes.
So that building's not going anywhere, as far as I know, right? That's in perpetuity, correct?
It's not protected.
It's not protected? It's
It's on
just
the registry.
recorded, but it's not protected, okay.
It has to,
Not
if you,
100%.
if you want to destroy it, you'd have to go through some serious hoops beyond the town of Walpole.
Okay, so I guess, so I'm not certainly personally, but I think I can speak for a lot of people in town that everybody wants to see this building, put back into the system, put back into use, have people enjoy it, or at least have it be vibrant enough where there's activity going on, whether it's a small bit of public and apartments or whatever it is, something, people going in and out of that building, having that building occupied and doing something. So I believe that the town, and I'm not speaking for the EDC here, but I believe that the town not only has an opportunity, but almost an obligation to do something with this building and to spend money on this building. So my question to you is, in terms of the gap, what's the number that the town would have to invest to make that gap small enough where it becomes more viable from a lending standpoint and from an investor standpoint? Where does that gap percentage need to be where people say, okay, now we're in business, now we're ready to go on this?
Caveat my answer with a lot of caveats. But, you know, for instance, for this that's shown now on the screen here, you know, this is a funding gap that shows, okay, it's going to cost $8 million, like we've talked about, or it's around 8.2 million. Given those rents and expenses, everything should be scrutinized, poked, and prodded over time as it gets more refined. But from a market perspective, you could go out and borrow debt and equity at about 3 million-ish. Given the discussion a minute ago, you could fill in another 1 million, 2 million, 5 or so with these tax credits that are somewhat predictable. You know, in parallel, I'd be certainly going after a whole bunch of other sources and really trying to work. Some of these buildings I've been involved with have 12 funding sources, 15 funding sources. But the funding gap order of magnitude is about 3 million.
So if the town was able to put $3 to $4 million into this building, it would become much more attractive for potential groups to come in and do what we want, which is get this building back in play.
Yes. and
Not, obviously not guaranteed, but
Yeah,
that's like a.
somewhere in that order of
Somewhere in that
magnitude.
area would make it more attractive.
And if I could just add to that, because I think not to keep looking backwards, but the Compass study, I think did a really great job of saying, there's a whole bunch of improvements here. They make the recommendation, not to paraphrase it, but don't do this until you know what the use is, because of that same thing we talked about earlier. You know, depending on what it is, it's going to take a different path. Those codes, the analysis, all that work that needs to be figured out, kind of needs to know what its use is. So I know there was a notion of, you know, clearing out and starting to do demo and bring it back to its original. And I think from those professionals, they said, don't do that yet. Figure out what the market or what the use will be. So I think, you know, as a development perspective, which is my role here, if this RFP went out and said, oh, and the town is going to have $3 million, that's.
I was gonna say, if there was a
Sitting
pledge,
alongside.
if there was a pledge for the town's involvement up to a certain number, that would make a difference.
It would make a huge difference. Then when, you know, developer X or operator Y picks this up and does an analysis, it doesn't look just like this, but probably comes to the order of magnitude conclusion, suddenly you're in a feasible range and not with that big 40% plus gap that sits there now.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Comments?
Eric, right?
That's right.
Mike Amaral, I'm one of the former Historical Commission chairmen and member. You said your firm has worked on buildings like this in the past.
Yeah, we do.
Can you give us some examples of, in Rhode Island or Massachusetts, or a local building that you did work on? And talk about it, or, you know, especially, was it a public building like this one? Was it just an old building, or?
Well, we're primarily an advisory firm. So, until recently, I've been working for Mass Development as an on-call consultant. So, under that umbrella, I've worked on a whole bunch of these kind of analyses level,
Yeah.
funding gap analysis. But from a delivery standpoint, you know, full financing, blah, 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 Yeah, quite a few buildings. Our office is Rumford Center in Rhode Island, which is a historic mill. I spent years doing the American Locomotive Works as an old mill. Just in last year, we did what is called Down City Phase 2, which is 7 historic buildings in Providence, from financing, project management, contracting, all of it. Yeah, and,
Okay.
we've done quite a few, either for our own portfolio again, or as a lead for going through this process and then actually going to the banks, going to the investors, going through the tax credit process. Quite a few.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say, Mark, what you said about, the town getting money together, I think that's a good idea, and this has been battered around for a long time. A little too long, I think. And it is the center of the town. Everybody would feel a huge amount of emptiness if that spot was, if something else was there, even if it was an attempt at trying to make it look the same out of wood. You know how they would do that. And, I'm just hoping that people can rally around this building. And it's time. It's been too long. I went through Holbrook Center recently. Holbrook Center has an old town hall. It is not as good-looking as this one. And I wouldn't consider Holbrook a better town than Walpole, but they renovated that building, and I think they're using it for town offices. Now, this is something that I've mentioned before, and it's just my opinion, but the town's going to keep growing, correct? As the town grows, we're going to need more office space. This is an old public school building. This was my grade school. I went to first through 4th grade here, or 5th grade. The town played musical chairs. They moved from the old town hall to this school building. So they turned a grade school into a town hall. Now the old town hall is empty. And one of my suggestions has been in the past that this building be used for town purposes, because we may end up needing it in the future. We could slowly move in. You may find that 20 years from now, the place is filled with town employees. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Just one question, Kevin Spenley from EDC, and it may not be you answering, I may answer myself, but, for the town to take over, that doesn't look like an $8 million investment if they were gonna do for their own purpose. They could go in and for a lot less infrastructure cost, become a town use building, right? For a lot less. And even less than what their investment could be in order to make it an economic center or some form of commerce. So I guess I'm answering my own question, but.
Agreed, but in my opinion, that if we're looking at it only financially, that probably does make the most sense from everything that I've read and studied with it. Back to Phil's, I think, spirit of your comments, Phil, is that maybe we want it to be what its original intended use was, which is a focal point for the center of the town for the people who live here. We're not going to be able to get to the bottom of that in this meeting, certainly not. But if we're throwing ideas around that will be on the record, I think that if the town was going to put money into this, my opinion would be it would be better spent on putting the money in and then letting an investor, shortening that gap, which will then allow investors to come in and turn it into something that might be more of a public space or whatever it ends up being in the center of town, as opposed to putting the same money in just to have the school department, whoever else is going to end up being there. So again, if we're stocking the same money, I wouldn't want or think Walpole would, I'd love them to do it. They built soccer fields for $11 million. They could probably put money into this building. However, it's a different argument. And I love the fields, by the way, so don't anyone accuse me of that. But I will say that I wouldn't necessarily want them to take this building over and run it as a performing arts center or something like that. I don't think that's what the town is supposed to do, but I think helping to make it a more viable opportunity for investors and builders would be a smart move. One last question for you. I don't know if I'm gonna put you on the spot or not, but I don't know who's paying your bill right now, so, but I'm still gonna ask the question. You don't, obviously, no specifics needed, but in a situation like this, where the gap has been so large, really unsurmountable, from what I'm hearing, without some involvement to the town, have you ever seen a project in your career where the gap was so sizable, where the town did not have to get involved with substantial dollars to make it happen? And further, beyond that, when towns have made the investment, have you been involved or seen successful projects that came out the other end?
So it's a lot to unpack. It's hard to imagine, and I can't think of one in which the town didn't play a role. Obviously, if there's a slug of money from the state, the town, it might not be the slug of money from the town, it might be the tax treaty, it might be something else, but
Right.
it's hard to imagine it getting done without the town participating in some way. And I think the town participating in a $0 value or $1 value, disposition or lease is participation. I'd want to give it some thought to case studies, and happy to put some together. But there are certainly projects with a gap like this, that non-economic factors,
Sure.
friends of town hall, municipal dollars, state dollars that come in, historic dollars come in, you start to cobble together and get it done.
And get it done, okay.
It usually doesn't happen in isolation. Usually there's a clear goal of what it's going to be and how you're going to leverage those dollars that will allow all parties to kind of put their dollars in, private, public, state, everybody kind of push their sources in. We'd certainly put together some case studies on where that's happened before.
Yeah, I don't want to run you through the ringer on that. I'm just saying that it seems like the only way forward in this building is with the town deciding, however they're going to cobble it together, using your words, that they're going to make a play to make this happen, as opposed to this languishing in, what are we going to do for another 5 years until that 8 million now is up to 12 million, and we've spent another 35,000 a year keeping it in limbo until, eventually a decision's going to need to be made. And I hope your models that you've put up and the work that you've done on it, which is much appreciated, I hope now that they see that it's less in the clouds, and now, hey, we have a range now. We kind of know where this is going to be. Maybe we can start doing constructive things and putting actual numbers next to them and see if we can make it happen. So hopefully that's what this has at least started to kick off a little bit. And, whatever the next steps are, I don't know. I know it doesn't sit with the Economic Development Commission, but certainly whatever the next steps are, I think I can say that the EDC and many, many more people around this town and in Town Hall want to see this happen. So I appreciate the work that you did. And I certainly appreciate you coming in and make the presentation for us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And if I could, oh,
Figure the gap. You figure the gap is, you figure the gap is $3 or $4 million to start with.
yeah, with my
Town-
caveats all around it.
Can you just give them your name first?
Cliff Barnes. But the gap doesn't end there. So if you put $3 or $4 million into the process and somebody comes in and they fail, then you have to go through the process all over again for the new tenant or whatever, and maybe have to upgrade to a different level. So it's not just that gap that you're saying there. It's potentially a gap for the next 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, you might argue, you know, if you brought that building up to modern standard and had active users, if they failed, you're that much closer to replacing that group. Obviously, if it's a complete change, you know, if you had an event operator in there and completely failed, and no event operator wanted to come back in after they failed, you might have to change that use again. But I think you'd be much closer to feasibility for the next group than you would be for that first group. That big first step of cost would be mostly
Depending on
behind-
what the new
The-
use is.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of must-dos in that building that would apply to a lot of uses. That once, is that what you're saying? That a
Yeah,
lot of
there's a
those
fixed
are.
cost to bring it up. Certainly, if you started changing program in the future, it just didn't work. Again, if you picked events in 10 years, 5 years from now, nobody would take that event space, nobody wanted it, the town didn't want to run it, and you had to go back to the drawing board, you'd have significant costs. You probably would have, you might not have that huge sort of shelf of fixed costs that you have right now of bringing it up from its, you know, inception to where it is now from a code perspective. But yeah, I agree with your point. I just think it might be worth looking at of, that big first step will make it easier in the future, but you never know if there's dramatic changes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cliff. Anyone else? No? Okay. Good.
Thank
Well,
you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
We
Is there a way
appreciate it.
that we could get this presentation, or is that for distribution, or is that for you?
See you later.
Happy to, no, whatever.
Totally up to you.
No, happy to share it.
That'd be good. If you could get it to
Are you there right now?
Pat, that'd be great,
Over
and
there
then,
right now?
yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cosmos. Maybe I'll see you, depending, how long are you gonna be there for?
Yeah, I think we're gonna
I like to
take
finish
care of
this
that. I don't think we have anything else. We don't have enough.
I'll
Donnell's
text you.
back
You can't hear.
How's on?
Donnell's on.
Oh, we can,
I know.
the minutes thing.
Donnell, can you hear me?
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thanks,
I'm
Phil.
here, but I got limited ability to speak, but go ahead.
I have to finish the meeting.
How long was he on for?
He's been on
I'll
since
text
the
you when I'm
president.
done.
Oh, good.
I'll see you, let's go. I'll see you, I'll text you. Okay.
Two things. Just an update on business forum.
Mr. Barnes.
And then
I see it here.
committee action that,
Yeah.
well, one of the other business
He can't
items
hear.
has to do with the wayfinding advisory committee.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. He's a great guy.
All right, well, I'm glad we have Danell, so that gives us a quorum regardless.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it.
Take care, all. Thank you.
Donnell, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep, I can
Yeah,
hear
we
you.
got you now.
So you got us-
Yeah, he can throw it up. Can you throw it up on the screen, Patrick?
There we go. How about now?
Now?
He's there, it's just the audio at the moment.
Yes, I can hear you.
He can hear us.
Okay.
It's just,
All right.
we're using my speaker, I guess. So we do have minutes. I don't know if you want to go over just minutes first?
Yeah, so when we started off, we wanted to vote on the minutes of December
20th.
20th, so I'll entertain a motion
Second
to approve
motion.
those.
Make the motion of
Want to make a
accepting
motion?
the December 20th, 2022 minutes.
We have a second? All in
I'll
favor?
second.
Aye.
Donnell, do you have a vote?
Yes, I.
Aye. All right.
Opposed and one abstention?
Abstention.
And
So,
now I want to turn it over to you for your updates. For the,
so I'm just going to provide updates to the business forum. So last time we met, we had discussion about starting a subcommittee to look into a potential business forum for March 9th. Kevin, myself, John Shelby, Harry, and Sarah Katib of Destination Downtown. We had a meeting last week, went over logistics in terms of finalizing a March 9th. This location, time,
Great.
thinking of between 7 and 9 of a start time, similar as we discussed. The location itself, my only update there, I spoke with Ken Fedek twice. Ken had a conversation, I believe, with the club. I think it's not finalized yet. I didn't get a definitive answer. I think there may have been either somebody was in transition, whether the manager was outgoing or a new manager was coming in, so he was reaching out to the club president just to kind of finalize that. So I'll touch base again with Ken just to make sure. I left a voicemail with the club as well, just to kind of follow up on my own end. So we just want to make sure we solidify that location first before proceeding with any advertisement material.
Okay.
That being said, I know Harry has a speaker lined up already for HR-related material, and I think he's working on a few others, one for marketing, one for accounting-related discussion. In terms of advertisement material, we have a business listing in town, so I worked up with Lauren, consolidating that, our spreadsheet to get that up to date and finalized. So we're pretty comfortable once we're ready, once we have everything secured in terms of, who, when, where, why, logistics, everything like that. Advertising it shouldn't be too much of a hurdle, just because we have that email listing and we have, Harry's contacts through Chamber and Destination Downtown's contacts. Along with the advertising material, we want to have some sort of way of capturing who will attend. So working through a few different platforms, I thought I was going to use Eventbrite, had a discussion in-house about maybe just having everything go through a Google Forms. That way we may be able to both do a registration link in order to track who can attend, and then also kind of use that as a mechanism to put a brief business survey out there as well, see if we can get some good data that way. So hoping to kind of get everything finalized in terms of just location, agenda, advertisement materials before the end of January. That way we can really spend the majority of February just getting the word out there, marketing.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
That sounds good.
So that's where we are.
Do we have any backups if the country club falls through?
So we went through a few different locations. Realistically, I guess we're in a weird position where the country club is probably the most fitting in terms of, I think 100 people is a typical capacity, and nothing around here is really large enough from an event space. You have other event spaces that probably could,
Maybe depending on the size of it, maybe Conrad's private room.
Yeah, once
that's
again.
that's the hard part, I guess, is
Oh, he's not open for breakfast, so I don't.
yeah.
So I think to answer your question, Mark, you were at that first discussion. There was a list of try this, try that. So I think it's more of finding out definitive and then going through the options that we're all aware of, what makes most sense to follow up on.
If for some reason it falls through, I mean, we could try to take another look at really scouring if there is a location that makes sense as a backup. But I think we've kind of run through that a few
Yeah.
times already.
Well, you should be fine that early in the year, the club's not busy, there's really no golf going on.
And we've had it there before, so it's not brand new to them.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, okay, I just wanted to
Yep.
ask the question.
No,
You never know, new manager, new, you
Well, they
never
have to
know.
make sure they have staff on,
True.
if they have their staff on that early or not, and.
And if let's say for some weird reason, they're not able to do it, I think if they're able to do it, they'll do it. So,
Yeah.
if for some reason they're not able to do it, we might have to go to a place and then limit response, and that might even make people want to come more.
Yeah.
Hey, question, what about these two new apartment buildings? Do they have any sort of open space that could be used as a backup?
I don't know about
Good idea.
Edgewater's building, but Union West, not really. I mean, they do, but nothing of that size.
Right, and then it'd have to be catered too, because they
Right.
don't have an in-house kitchen and all that stuff.
I think that's why the country club just works out, having.
Does,
stuff
totally
there.
works out.
This was more of an internal discussion, and I didn't bring this really forward to the subcommittee, but we're here all now. So the breakfast concept, that seems to be what was done in the past, and that was successful from what everyone remembers. I guess, offhand, I didn't know if does lunch make sense more? I know we've kind of discussed this already. I'm just thinking, I know this has we're still figuring everything out and wanting to get
Yeah.
all this.
It's always been breakfast, whatever, for whatever reason, I don't know, but it's just
Yeah.
always been breakfast.
Okay.
Right.
I think it's easiest for people because it's
Probably
7 to
busy
9 and
Working,
Yep.
people
it's
going to
just
work.
before the day starts, and
Gotcha.
once you get into the middle of the day,
It's hard to leave.
And attendees and presenters and town administration, same thing. I think that's.
now,
what
if you
drove
wanted
that.
to change it to Conrad's at 5 o'clock and have a cocktail hour, well, there's nothing
We're all
wrong with
gonna be
that.
there anyway.
Just saying.
No, I agree with you. I think that,
Sometimes cocktails will get people there more
Yeah,
than
I
eggs.
agree with that.
I think
agree.
cocktails are more mixer-oriented than informational, so I don't think either one is wrong, but I think that if we're gonna have speakers with information, perhaps the breakfast would be more appropriate.
A separate.
Doesn't mean we shouldn't do mixers.
I mean, I've been
Yeah,
to
I
enough.
think it's separate, if you,
Yeah,
if you just treat it as like a separate, you brought this up before, Mark, I mean, if you treat it as like a separate networking event and maybe
Right.
just a topic of discussion before going into just networking, I think
Right.
that the nighttime makes sense too.
yeah,
I've been
absolutely.
to a few of those are nice to go to, so,
Yeah.
yep.
Okay.
In addition, so I guess the one last piece of news is, I mentioned got a grant for technical assistance for a wayfinding and branding program. And this is through a chosen consultant from DHCD. The consultant is Favorman Designs. What this is really entails is the consultant who's used this platform, and I think about 40 to 50 other communities that have received this similar grant, takes a look at the community overall in terms of historical context, character, prominent features, and implement and takes those elements through the look of branding in placemaking and kind of also incorporates that into design elements for signage and for gateway signage, banners, pedestrian directional signage. It's a very, all the minutia of like a planner and a graphic designer, I guess, go into something like this. And so the process it's a fairly interesting concept, and it's something that's been successful. You'll see it in places like Plymouth or Salem, or even at Patriots Place. When you drive by there, you notice they have a distinctive branding and signage, trying to orient people to key locations. So this process is hoping to start this February and go through June. It's a pretty quick process, one night a month, probably 3 to 5 meetings tops, or actually, I guess 5 meetings if you're going from February to June. The goal of which is to work with this committee as local, as kind of that local guidance and perspective with the consultant, and the consultant will be able to use that local knowledge to help base his decision on his recommendations for a final plan. That final plan will include, cost estimates. It'll include at least 3 different design suggestions, as well as what we would call a hierarchy of wayfinding signage from things such as parking signs, gateway signs, kiosk signage, even something as like distinctive as like benches and trash cans, anything like that. It's very much up to what the town feels makes sense for them. And so the process, like I said, it's open to start in February. And as part of that, there's an advisory committee that was appointed by the select board at the last meeting on January 10th. Composition included 7 members, and then myself as an ex officio member, so 8. But of those 7 members, 1 was recommended to be an Economic Development Commission member. So that's why I'm talking to you all here, and I know Donnell's joining us remotely. Hoping to get if anyone would want to volunteer or interested in being part of that process. Like I mentioned, it's 1 night a month. We're probably going to work on the schedule once the committee is appointed and figure out a date that works for everybody on a monthly basis, and then work with that. It'd likely be a night meeting with a hybrid option for people that can join remotely. So,
And we're looking for 1 member from EDC.
1 member from EDC.
Anybody interested? I mean, I can do it if no one, I know you guys are currently doing.
How long would the meetings run for, Pat?
February to June?
I mean, how
February?
long each meeting would be, like roughly?
I would say 1 to 2 hours, depending on contact, but probably, I mean, that's conservative estimate, 1 to 2.
Okay.
I can't see anything more than 1.5, 2, depending on how the discussion goes. Donnell, did you say something? I think I had you on mute by accident. Donnell?
No, it's gone.
Donnell, you there? All right. I don't think he may not be there. So I guess, questions or any other thoughts from anybody else?
Do we need that name now?
Right.
Because I don't
I'll
mind
get
doing
back to
it.
you. Let me think about it.
I mean, we only need one, right?
Only need one. Ideally, we do have our first meeting in February. I've been kind of putting the emphasis when I've reached out to the other appointed groups, February 1st. I know this board meets on was it third Tuesday of the month, so it's probably
Do
a
you know who
little
else
bit
is
later
on-
than I'd like to
Do
be.
you know who else is on the board?
Yep, so, sorry, the other members are a member of Historical Mission or Cultural Council, a member of the Select Board, a member of, no, I'm sorry, a citizen at large, a member of the Police Department, a member of DPW. Let me just double check.
It's okay, that's a gist. I have to think about it, too.
I'll do it. I mean, if you
Oh,
need
you're
the
gonna-
name,
Yeah, all right, then I won't
Yeah.
think of if you do it.
I don't mind doing it.
Okay.
I know we got a lot of subcommittees going on, and
Yeah.
I know that you guys are involved in a lot of things, so I don't mind doing that at all. So you can put my name down for that, Patrick.
Okay. I don't know if I need to vote or not.
Oh, do we have to vote on that?
No, I can just take it as is. It's fine. If you want to volunteer for that, then I'll probably just forward your name to Aoife, for the select board. So the select board is technically the appointing authority, but it's more or less present the names to them and we'll get going from
Yeah,
there.
okay, sounds good.
Excellent.
All right.
So is that, we don't have anything else, right?
We don't have anything else, so we
Can you guys hear me?
I think we're ready to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Danell, thank you. I know he's freezing his
Aye.
butt off out there.
I'm cold. I don't know why my feet are so cold.
This room is cold.